You're told to avoid debt like the plague, but what if the entire world is swimming in it? What if the numbers are so astronomical that they defy comprehension? And what if this debt is not just a number, but a shadowy figure influencing global politics, economies, and your very own future? Let's unravel what they don't want you to know about global debt. Global debt highlight. Let's talk about global debt. Imagine you saved up all your allowance and spent it on candy, but then you wanted more candy, so you borrowed money from your parents. Now you owe them, right? Well, countries do the same thing, but on a much bigger scale. As of the first half of 2023, the world debt reached a jaw-dropping $307 trillion. That's a lot of zeros. Most of this increase, about 80%, came from rich countries like the United States. But here's the thing, borrowing isn't always bad. Sometimes countries need to borrow money to build schools and hospitals, or even to help people during tough times like a pandemic. The problem starts when the debt keeps piling up and becomes too much to handle. This can lead to big problems, like less money for important things and even economic crisis. Debt versus GDP. Now, you might have heard adults talking about something called GDP, which stands for Gross Domestic Product. Think of it as the total value of all the goods and services a country produces in a year. It's like your report card, but for a country's economy. People often compare global debt to global GDP to see if the world is borrowing too much. Right now, the world's debt is almost 3 times its GDP. Sounds scary, doesn't it? But hold on. Debt is something that adds up over many years, while GDP is measured yearly. It's like comparing the total money you've saved in your piggy bank to the money you get as a weekly allowance. They're not the same thing. So, is it fair to compare debt to GDP? Not really. It's like comparing apples to oranges. While the ratio might look alarming, it doesn't give the full picture. Who do we owe? Okay, so who does the world owe all this money to? It's not like there's a giant piggy bank in the sky that we borrow from. In reality, the world owes money to itself. When a country borrows money, someone else lends it. So, one country's debt is another country's asset. But it's not just countries lending to each other. Banks, companies, and even regular people like you and me can own a piece of this debt through things like bonds. So, in a way, the world owes money to its future self. If everyone plays fair and square, it should all balance out. But if some countries can't pay back what they owe, it could create a domino effect, causing problems for everyone involved. Sustainability. Now, let's dive into the big question. Can the world handle a debt that's 3 times its GDP? Some experts think it's possible, but there are conditions that need to be met. First, let's talk about what a credible fiscal plan really means. In simple terms, it's a government's game plan for how they're going to use the money they're borrowing and how they're going to pay it back. Think of it like a family budget, but on a much larger scale. Governments need to show that they have a well-thought-out plan for their spending and their income, which usually comes from taxes. Now, why is this so important? Well, if a government doesn't have a solid plan, it can lead to a lot of problems. For example, the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, has warned that the government's interest costs could nearly double over the next decade, rising to 3.6% of the GDP by 2033. That's a big deal because these interest costs are on track to overtake the entire defense budget by next year. So, without a good plan, a government could find itself in a situation where it's spending more money on paying back its debts than on things like defense, education, or healthcare. According to the Penn-Wharton budget model, the US debt held by the public cannot exceed about 200% of GDP under today's market conditions. If it does, the US has about 20 years to take corrective action before the government defaults on its debt. One way to prevent this is by increasing tax revenues. The federal government's financial report warns that to stabilize the debt at current levels, the government will have to run primary surpluses equal to 0.6% of GDP. This is a tall order, especially when you consider the widening gap between federal spending and tax revenues. President Biden's FY 2024 budget proposes $4.5 trillion in new revenues over the next decade, partly by repealing some policies enacted in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts, TCJA of 2017. But who really bears the burden when taxes go up? In 2001, the top 1% of taxpayers paid 33% of federal income taxes. By 2020, this group was shouldering more than 42% of federal income taxes. If they were to pay the same shares today as they did in 2001, their burden would fall by $159 billion. On the flip side, the bottom 50% of taxpayers paid 4.9% of all income taxes in 2001. In 2020, they paid just 2.32%. If they were to shoulder the same share today, it would mean a tax hike of nearly $84 billion. However, raising taxes isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. For instance, if markets believe the US government won't enact serious fiscal reform, debt dynamics could make the situation worse. In 2023, inflationary government spending led to rising interest rates, which in turn slowed economic growth and reduced tax revenues. This created a vicious cycle where the budget deficit grew, accelerating the national debt and drawing the day of fiscal reckoning closer. And last but not least is boosting economic growth. According to Forbes, the US economy is expected to see an annualized real GDP growth of over 5% in the third quarter of 2023. This is a significant increase compared to the growth of over 2% for the prior 4 quarters. The Atlanta Federal Reserve's GDP Now also suggests that this growth will be underpinned by strong consumer spending and reasonable growth in private inventories. NPR reports that despite high interest rates, the US economy continues to show resilience, driven largely by consumer spending and a strong job market. Unemployment has been under 4% for 20 months, and wages are rising faster than prices. So, boosting growth isn't just about making numbers look good on paper, it has real-world implications. It means businesses thrive, people get better paying jobs, and the government has more money to pay off debts without raising taxes. However, achieving this growth is a complex task that requires careful planning and execution. It involves encouraging consumer spending, creating jobs, and fostering an environment where businesses can flourish. But it's not without its challenges. Fast growth can put upward pressure on prices, leading to inflation, which is a concern for policymakers. Therefore, managing growth is a delicate balancing act that requires attention to multiple economic indicators and sectors. But even if all these conditions are met, there are still risks. For example, if something unexpected happens, like a natural disaster or a war, it could mess up the whole plan. Also, if governments don't stick to their plans, or if something goes wrong, it could lead to a financial crisis. That's when things get really bad, and people start losing their jobs, businesses close, and the government has even less money than before. So, is it sustainable? The answer is maybe. It's like walking on a tightrope. If you're careful and everything goes as planned, you'll make it to the other side. But if you make a wrong move, you could fall. That's why experts are keeping a close eye on the situation. They know that the world is in a delicate balance, and it's going to take a lot of work to keep it that way. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing and sharing so we can keep bringing more content like this. See you next time.